Hi everyone, I'm here today now with my hybrid monkey reptilian friend, and I would like to explain to you a little more about the concept of the TRI-UNE brain. The TRI-UNE brain is developed by neuroscientist Paul MacLean in the 1960s, and it really helps us to understand better that when we have our panic attacks, when we go into anxiety mode, when we feel like I can't think, I'm just stuck here, my heart rate's going really high, I'm hyperventilating, all of the symptoms that we get when we feel really dysregulated, there is actually a very logical explanation for it. And what is that explanation? The explanation is that actually in our DNA is the DNA of our ancestors. So a very, very long time ago, we were peoples, Neanderthals, who had to run away from saber-toothed tigers, who had to really, be very aware that at any moment, if we didn't run or if we didn't fall down and pretend that we're dead, or if we didn't try to fight back, then we literally get eaten and we die. So nowadays, when we have our fears, when we have our traumatic triggers, such as some of us, we might have been in car accidents, and then when we get into a car and we have to hold the steering wheel, we might sense a kind of hyper-arousal happening in the body. And that's because we're being triggered, and it's our brain tricking us, or rather messaging us into thinking that, be careful now, something terrible is going to happen. So let's look at why and how that happens. So, all of us, we look civilized. This is supposed to be the most civilized part of our brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, which is the top kind of layer covering of the brain, was developed in the most recent years. So as we became civilized, as we became people that came up with language, as we became people that were interested in developing culture, when we became logical and rational and able to be calm and connected, then the prefrontal cortex is responsible for that. But before we developed this, actually two other parts of the brain developed first. So when we were more like animals, when we were more like cellular beings, all we had was the reptilian brain. And so, ta-da, I'm just going to take us into the most inner part of the brain, which is our primitive reptilian brain. So when we were kind of more like reptiles and we were just floating around in the swamps, we really only needed a heart rate and we really only needed to breathe. So our brainstem, which is in the very back and down into the spinal cord of our bodies, is controlling our heart variability and also our breath rate. So when you start feeling dysregulated and your heart starts to go really fast and you can't control your breathing, is because the second part of the brain that was developed, which is our mammalian brain, so right in here, our mammal brain has an emotional center and also a crazy little creature that kind of sends out warning signs. So this little guy here, he's responsible for us panicking and freaking out. And his name is actually the amygdala. So the amygdala, even though it's just ever so tiny, it works through neuroception. So basically, it is a nonverbal form of communication. So when you get in the car and you sense the smell of the car, when your hands are holding the steering wheel and you start feeling kind of fearful, is because the amygdala is sending these nonverbal messages to you, telling you, oh my goodness, remember what happened, this is dangerous. And in the same way that the amygdala warns somebody who might be afraid of driving, it's also what happens when you're a child and you were frightened. So as a child before the age of 9, we might be living very much actually in our limbic brain, our reptilian brain, and our emotional brain. Our prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until we're about 12 years old. So when you had experienced something that really made you scared as a kid, and you are an adult, and all of a sudden you see a sight, or you smell a smell, or you hear a sound that brings you right back to that trigger without you being conscious exactly of why that is or what that's connected to, your amygdala immediately starts sending these messages that you have to fight or run away or freeze and pretend you're dead. Or actually, more than human beings, even worse, we become pleasers. So when you become a fawning person. So how do we bring ourselves to have more access to our prefrontal cortex, to our most recently developed part of the brain, our civilized thinking brain? We can do that by doing things that strengthen this neural path and our access. You can meditate, you can sing, you can do creative, pleasurable things, you can increase your social connection, and there are all kinds of ways of doing practices like yoga and even slow belly breathing. So by allowing ourselves to not just sit there and feel helpless, we can actually allow ourselves to know that whenever we are regulated and calm and have the spaciousness to do some of these practices that increase our ability to have access to our prefrontal cortex, that eventually is going to increase your window of tolerance and your ability to be with your triggers. And at that moment, then, when you encounter your trigger again, you will know that, oh, wait a minute, this is just a trigger. This is just something that is tricking my mind to thinking that I'm back in that situation. And when you have your prefrontal cortex active and connected, then you'll be able to tell that that was in the past. And right now, I'm in the present and I'm safe in the present. So I hope that we'll be able to practice together these ways of increasing your access to your calm, compassionate, cool, collected brain, the prefrontal cortex.